Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Yonit Arthur. I'm an audiologist and coach. You're on the Steady Coach. One amazing thing about the Steady Coach YouTube channel and podcast, having been around for several years now, is that there is just so much information available to you now for free if you're trying to recover from neural circuit dizziness, PPPD, MDDS, vestibular migraine, other types of medically unexplained chronic dizziness symptoms. And by the way, if you're not sure that's you, see a video I'm linking in the video and podcast description that'll let you know if this applies to you. The disadvantage, of course, of having this much information is that there is just so much information to sift through, especially when you're not feeling great. And it can be especially challenging to figure out which tools and strategies to use when you have a particular challenge come up during recovery. That is the topic of today's conversation with Tanner Murtagh, RSW. This is Tanner's second time on my channel for good reason, because he's awesome. Tanner is a registered social worker. He is also the director of Pain Psychotherapy Canada. You can find his information linked in the video and podcast description. Tanner also has his own great YouTube channel, which will also be linked in the video description. Now, today, Tanner and I are taking a fresh look at some of the most common challenges that you are facing during your recovery. In this conversation, Tanner and I are going to address 6 common challenges that people face during the recovery process from neural circuit dizziness and other neural circuit symptoms like tinnitus and hyperacusis. We are going to talk about hypervigilance, or that symptom scanner that keeps looking for symptoms even though you're not trying to anymore. We're going to talk about how to handle guilt. We're going to talk about what to do when you're dealing with a ton of what-ifs and doubts, how to help yourself regulate if you're dealing with a lot of anxiety and or if you've had significant trauma in your life. And we're also going to talk about how to get started when you're just so sensitive that you can't really do regular exposure work yet, or if you can't do somatic tracking because, well, it just makes you focus on your symptoms more. I think there's something for everyone in this conversation. Whether a specific challenge applies to you or not, Tanner is going to give you very concrete ways of working with all 6 of them, and you're going to be able to take something away from this conversation that you can apply today. Please let us know what you think of this conversation. I think this is a really useful format, and I'd love to do more like this if you're interested. You can leave questions and comments in the comment section below on YouTube. If you're not on YouTube, please consider heading over to YouTube to leave your comment. And you can also like the video, share it, subscribe to my channel. These things really help me reach more people. You can also give the podcast a follow and consider leaving us a 5-star rating if you think we deserve it. All right, please enjoy this awesome conversation with Tanner. Tanner, welcome back.
Hi, it's good to see you again.
So good to see you again. We were just remarking off camera that we just saw each other a week ago. So it really hasn't been that long, but I was so excited to see you again today.
I know, we're spending a lot of time together recently.
It's good. It's good. And I'm particularly excited about what we're going to be talking about today. So we have a lot of the same understanding of neural circuit stuff, neural circuit symptoms, but we have oodles of different kinds of training in how and approaches in terms of how we work with them. So I wanted to bring you some sort of case examples with specific problems that are really common among people who have neural circuit dizziness, tinnitus, hyperacusis, and other symptoms, and really just get your take on how you would work with a client who had those problems and how you might advise someone who's trying to do it on his or her own with those problems.
Yes. No, I really like this idea for, I've never done something like this, and I've never done something like this when I'm interviewing someone else. So it's a great idea to go back and forth and share some ideas about cases.
Right? Well, because these are the number one types of questions. That was a very awkward sentence, what I just said. But anyway, you understand what I'm saying. These are the most commonly asked questions when I do my Q&As with my coaching group, because people are really trying to work on this on their own, or they're working with a coach and they're like, Yonit, I have this really specific issue. I have this scanner that's hypervigilant and it's constantly pointing out symptoms to me, even when I'm not feeling anxious. Or I can't somatic track because when I somatic track, I just overfocus on my symptoms. What do I do about that? Or I have so many intrusive thoughts and doubts. How do I even work with those? So these are real examples, even though I kind of made up the case studies. These are real examples of questions that I get all the time. And it'll be so wonderful for people to hear your fantastic perspective because you're so experienced and so skilled. I'm excited. I'm going to learn today too.
It's good. Yeah.
All right. So I thought I would just start by kind of giving you just a little bit of the background on the first one and then pointing out the things that I typically would get asked questions about in this case. Is that all right?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. So let's say we have a client, a woman in her 30s, symptoms started with a sudden attack of vertigo, lots of doctor's visits, went through the medical rigmarole, and finally was diagnosed with vestibular migraine and PPPD. And this person, since getting the diagnosis, has just kind of slowly gotten back to functioning, is back at work, is kind of able to live life, but just not with high quality of life because just symptoms are omnipresent and uncomfortable. And one of the things that she's noticed is a symptom scanner that's constantly monitoring how she feels. So she knows that she's done a little bit of mind body or neuroplastic research and knows like I shouldn't be focusing on my symptoms or putting a ton of attention on them, but I just can't help it. This scanner just shows up like anytime I'll just be minding my own business and the scanner is just looking for symptoms. And if I don't have them, it finds them and then it amplifies them, right?
Yeah.
So there's that. And then the other piece that she's really struggling with in this case is she feels a ton of guilt over just not being able to live the way that she wants to live for her, say she has children or a partner or friends, family, co-workers, and she's not able to perform the way that she normally performs. And it's been a big change in her quality of life. So so I would love to hear, how would you work with her or advise her to start working on this symptom scanner, the one like this hypervigilance that's constantly looking for symptoms?
Yeah. It's such a common thing that we both see. Whatever symptom people have, like they're scanning, they're checking, they're looking. And it becomes the problem I think that you're kind of hitting on here is it becomes like automatic where they don't even need to be like fully conscious of it. Like this is like an automatic thing that snaps in.
That's right.
And there's different people in how they experience this. Like some people are very present when they're doing it. Like they're very much like, this is like where like 100% of their brain power is going. And then there's other people where it's almost just happening in the background. And if something's noticed, they latch on.
Yeah.
So I think there's two different things. There's similar ways you work with both, of course. But the first thing is almost there needs to be an awareness. Like they need to like, and I don't want people to become hypervigilant about this, but I think there needs to be this light awareness of when am I looking? When am I checking? When am I thinking? When am I talking about it? That needs to be there. Like there needs to be this mindful awareness of what's taking place, because essentially what's happening here, and the end goal is that it reduces, they stop the scanning and they start to live life more fully. They're leaning into things they enjoy. They lean into things that maybe work or emotional state, whatever it is. Like they're more embodied in their life internally and externally. That's the end goal, which I think it's important we explain to people like that. That's what we're going for here. But that's a hard thing. It's a hard thing when we have chronic dizziness or other chronic symptoms, because people they don't want to have this embodied sense because it feels really unpleasant. And so one thing I see with people is they almost snap out of their body and into their mind because it feels, it's still distressing and unpleasant, but it feels like a safer place to be to some degree. And so, the first step is like the awareness of when their mind is moving in this direction, because we're trying to retrain their brain out of that. But if they're not aware of like all the times it's happening, it's really hard to do. Like, for example, one thing I was not aware, because I had widespread debilitating pain for several years. At first, it was really conscious, where I was like consciously really thinking about my pain all the time, like checking on it, like testing it, moving body parts to see if it's there. But over time, it became just unconscious, where I was just functioning in this way. And I think a lot of people listening probably relate to that, where it just becomes this unconscious thing where they're not even fully aware of it. So the starting place is, when I'm first working with someone, and I don't want to make it hyper vigilant and all serious and like unpleasant, but I do want to make it a bit of a game. Like I want to make it this game, this experiment of like, hey, like as you go about your day, like see how many times you can catch your mind like drifting in this direction. Like see how many times you can like tally this up. I do it, even the way I'm saying it is how I would tell someone to do this, because I'm trying to make it this like as light as possible. I know symptoms are not a light experience, but as light as possible. Like, let's make this an experiment. Like, how many times can you catch your mind thinking about this out of nowhere or scanning your body to check? Because that's where we need to go at first. And then once you're there, once there is that awareness and you're almost retraining your brain to at least catch when the hypervigilance is happening, catch when that like scanning is taking place. The second part's a little trickier. Not to say that part wasn't tricky, because that can be hard. The second part is that there needs to be a shifting. And you have a lot of choice here. But after you start to catch yourself looking, checking, thinking, talking about your symptoms, there needs to be a shift. And this is where people need to really experiment. And this person would really need to experiment to find like, what's the best way that I can shift? For some people, it can still be very cognitive, where they can shift to a safety message. My body's okay. It's not damaged. I know I'm doing okay. And by catching this and shifting, I can heal eventually. Like sometimes that will work. For some people, the cognitive, they'll do a message of safety and then they'll have 50 negative thoughts that follow.
That's right.
Right. So,
or they'll be like, yeah, I'm safe. I don't believe it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Like I think, and I remember that with myself. Like it's so easy to get into that obsessiveness that so like sometimes the message of safety work really well for people. I've seen that happen. For some, they're not. But I don't want people to lose hope. Like if you relate to this case and you practice that and it's not going well, there's a lot of things you can practice shifting to. There really is. You could practice shifting to a behavior. This is one of my favorite ones, because essentially what I'm trying to teach people to do is live life, both pleasant and unpleasant. Like, can you shift to focusing on this work task at work, or being kind of passionate or creative about a work task that you're working on? Could you shift to having a conversation with a family member or coworker and practice being very present moment? Because essentially we're trying to retrain the scanning out and train in this present moment connectedness to how you're living life. The thing about
that's different from ignoring.
Yes, it's different than ignoring, because the ignoring, and I know we relate to this, the ignoring is like you're running away, like you're running away as fast as you possibly can. This is like you're running towards something, like you're running towards or leaning in, right, to living life in some capacity. And you don't want just big behaviors. Like, for example, if I'm caught in a thought spiral, sometimes I go to the steam room at my gym. That's great and all, but I can't go to the steam room every time I'm having a negative thought about something.
Or do a 20-minute meditation. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So like you want things that are really accessible and easy. Like I've had people where they prepare a warm tea at home or work and really lean into like mindfully preparing the tea, boiling the water, picking their tea out. It's a practice. Like we're practicing people being present in the behaviors that they're doing about the day. And they're not going to be able to do this once and never do it again. That's the other thing.
I had someone who's not quite in this situation very recently who together we worked on coming up with basically a mantra she was going to use. It was just the appropriate thing for her to do. That was basically like a mantra involving self-compassion, like a message of self-compassion for herself and seeing herself as her younger self. That's actually not what I'm getting at here. And she practiced it for 2 weeks, and then she's like, it's just not working. And I said, hang on, like, this is not going to happen quickly when you have a scanner that's been around for a long time.
Yeah. It's not going to happen quickly, and it's not going to be perfect. And the one thing I'm careful as I explain these types of strategies to people is don't try and make it perfect. You're just going to create a whole lot more frustration and kind of like fight energy with your symptom. Like you're going to have off times. Like you're going to have times you get stressed and then all of a sudden you're scanning rapidly all the time. Like that's normal in retraining your brain to do something different. Like there's going to be flares of this scanning take place at points. You're looking for these small healing wins. Like, did I manage to scan 1% less today? Great. That's huge. Like that's a big thing. And I think people get so caught with kind of the ways a lot of people with neuroplastic symptoms cope, myself included. We're so hyper focused and perfectionistic, but this isn't going to be a perfect thing. Like you're looking for these small healing wins of, you know what, like I didn't fully enjoy that conversation with that coworker at work, but I was more present. Like I remember what they said. Like I remember like thinking in my responses, like I was more in the moment compared to what I usually have been. That's a healing win. Like you're looking for these small little moments because each one of those little moments is slowly retraining your system out of constantly scanning.
Mm.
So the behaviors is one of them. The last one that I have a preference to because I do a lot of somatic work, but it doesn't work for everyone, is shifting somatically to something. And you don't need to shift to do a 20-minute meditation, like you said, every time you're happy. I've had some great success with people where every time they caught themselves scanning, they'd shift to their body and do a certain breathing pattern for 2 or 3 breaths and then move on with their day, refocus. It can work. Like it gives you a little burst of regulation and then you shift back out to living life. Like that can be really effective. The other thing that I know you'll probably like is shifting to the emotion underneath the
I
scanner.
love that. Yeah.
It's really key because we get so lost in the scanning and the thoughts. But I like the concept that a therapist named Deb Dana talks about is story follows state. It is. The story in your mind a lot of times is not just like clicking on, like it's following the state of your body. It's following the state of your emotional state, your nervous system state. And so sometimes going to the source can be helpful. Like if people have already, like if this person's already been doing some emotional work, some nervous system work, great. Because that way you have a place to shift, you can explore the dysregulation, and then you can go out and try to refocus on life again.
Brilliant.
So that's my really long answer, but there's a lot that you could play around with here. It's just not going to be a straight line and it'll take some consistency for sure.
Awesome. Awesome strategies. Loved this. I just, as you were talking, I'm like, oh my gosh, people are going to get so much out of this conversation. I did want to ask, because I'm channeling all the people who are going to listen to this, and I know what they're going to ask and what they're going to say and what their minds are saying. So I was hoping, I think I know the answer to this, but I want to make sure we're on the same page. When you're just describing something like using a somatic tool, should the person then expect the scanner to shut up and go away right afterwards?
Oh yeah.
Or,
No, definitely not.
okay.
But again, it's like a small win where you're choosing to focus somatically instead of be lost in your mind, even if it's just for that 30 seconds.
Right.
And that is a little win. Like it's a little retraining of like, I don't need to be so lost cognitively. Like I can shift my body, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. Like people have different experiences, but it's not going to be automatic. The problem with the scanning and stuff is I find that like any work with thoughts, like it just needs to be very consistent because it's just thoughts are really tricky. That scanner is really tricky. Like it will trick you into all of a sudden be lost in it for 3 hours. And then you realize like, oh, I'm back here again. So like I find actually working with sensations a lot easier than working with thoughts.
Yeah.
It can be unpleasant and hard, but sensations move much slower. Thoughts are really fast and they're really tricky, and your mind scanning or checking for symptoms, it almost tricks us into it. So I think, like I said, like make it a bit of a game so you're not like battling and fighting and having this frustrated energy. Like make it a game of like trying to catch and then shift.
Yeah.
In any of those ways.
And I want to point out here for people listening, you're describing what would be an excellent process goal. So we're always shouting from the hilltops about outcome independence, stop focusing on what your symptoms are doing, focus on the other things that you're doing along the way that are going to get you there, and trust the process. I know, I'm sorry. I did that in quotation marks for people just listening. I know that's incredibly cliche, but
Yeah.
people need goals. You do need to know that you're actually getting somewhere. And this is something that you can actually, quote unquote, measure. How much better am I at just responding to my scanner in a way that's constructive?
Yes. And the scanner doesn't need to be completely destroyed and disintegrated for you to heal fully.
That's right. That's right.
I have seen people, fully recover and the scanning's still happening to some degree. Like it's almost
Yeah.
like their symptom got the message quicker than their scanner got the message that we don't need this anymore. So it does, like, I just want to be clear, like it's not an all or nothing thing. Trust the process. It's an old quote, but it's a useful quote, and just that you're just chipping away at it.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent point. All right. So how about the guilt that she's dealing with in this situation?
Yeah. So the guilt will depend on, well, it really depends on, I know this is like a fake case example, but it depends on
Yes.
one question that I would ask the person. Is someone in your life, family or friends, causing you to feel that way? And this is a hard question to ask, but is there people that are like, with their behavior, with their words, causing you to feel that way about your symptoms and about how you're living life? Or is it more kind of like, I'm careful saying self-induced because I don't want to have that blame feel, but is it more kind of self-induced in the sense that like there really isn't anything happening in the outside world that would be triggering this symptom outside of like how I feel inside? So I think those two things would be different potentially, right?
Excellent point.
Because like, yeah, like if someone in your life, I think that's where a conversation needs to be had, boundaries need to be set, expression of emotion definitely needs to take place. And if it's more, and in both, actually, what needs to happen is there needs to be a processing of the guilt either way. Because sometimes guilt's a tricky one because guilt can sink into shame really fast. And that's an even harder emotion. Like, I think if you ever ask anyone, like, okay, what's the hardest emotion for you to deal with? Shame's going to be a pretty high on the top of the list. Guilt's going to be a close second to a lot of people. But I think there does need to be some somatic work of getting used to the sensation of guilt and understanding that it's not necessarily it. It makes sense why we feel this way, because when we have symptoms and we're not living the way that we want, we're not supporting the people the way we want, it's hard, right? Because like we feel that way. But at the same time, I always tell people, and I think this would come back to the cognitive of understanding that anyone let's even think about a marriage. You're never going to go through 50 years of a marriage without people needing one another, without people suffering at points and struggling and not giving it their 50%. Like that's gonna happen. And so sometimes I really explain to people, like, even if you've had symptoms for 5 years, like this happens to people. We have struggles as human beings, and like I would really work towards understanding like it's okay to have that support right now. Like it's okay to get the support from other people, to get what you need, to kind of feel safe in your relationships and feel safe in your body right now. Like I think some of that conversation needs to happen, which could lower the guilt as well. But I think at the end of the day, there needs to be a somatic sense of safety that's built over time with the guilt. So someone feels at least that it's not threatening. Like they can feel into it, they can notice it, they can explore it, they can breathe with it, they can remind themselves they're actually safe to have this feeling.
Yes.
Because in doing that, like it's the famous quote of like, what we resist persists. This happens with any emotion, but especially happens with guilt or shame. People like resist that to next level, but the more you resist that and push it away, whether it's appropriate or not, it's just going to escalate everything. And so like I think to some degree there needs to be an approaching of that feeling, but then there also needs to be a challenging of what is kind of triggering that guilt in your mind or in your body.
That's right. So what I'm hearing is essentially what you're saying is we need to build tolerance.
Yeah.
We need to build tolerance of guilt. So someone in this position, again, just this case example. So say she's finding the guilt is making it very hard for her to, practice some of the, hey, I'm actually not going to go to that thing. Or actually, I am going to go do that thing that I want to do, even though it's an inconvenience for the family or whatever it is. Sometimes it's a do and sometimes it's a not to do.
Yeah.
She needs to become have a greater ability to tolerate the feelings of guilt that may bring, because first of all, behaviorally, that's going to allow her to actually do the things she needs to do to recover. But that's also going to greatly reduce the distress she feels, the stress, the danger signal essentially that she's getting from the guilt.
Yeah. And the happy side effect of doing exactly what you just explained is that if you have more of a tolerance to sit with guilt, first off, yeah, you're going to do more things for yourself to actually take care of your needs, but you're going to feel less distressed by that guilt. And then you're actually going to be able to provide more for the people around you as well. So I think it's like, it's an interesting thing that happens because, for myself, I've grown quite a bit of tolerance of guilt over time. But back when I had symptoms or even before that, I would get guilty and it would just wipe me out for 2 days. Like it would be like, I just couldn't tolerate that. And the more I got distressed about the guilt, the more my symptoms got worse. So there's like this negative feedback loop that can happen with this. Now, I don't want people doing this with the goal in mind, but it does happen as well, where the less distress we have, generally the less symptoms we have as well. And so like, I think it really comes down to like being able to approach guilt and cultivate some safety with it too.
That is an excellent point. I have said this to people, and I don't say this to just anyone, but in certain circumstances, I tell people, your feelings of guilt are about you, not about the other person. Your inability to tolerate this guilt is about you not wanting to feel guilty. It's not really about serving the other person in many cases, because people often know that cognitively. Like, I know I need to do this thing. I know they'd be okay, but I just feel so bad about it. So ultimately, I think, again, I'm not going to challenge everyone in the way that I just suggested, but it's really worth thinking about that often your own guilt reflects your inability to tolerate discomfort, not actually what's going to hurt someone else.
That's exactly it. And by approaching that felt sense of being guilty and then doing the thing that you need to do to take care of yourself anyways,
yes,
like both like are going to be really beneficial, because then like people actually have more awareness of themselves inside and they realize like, even though I felt guilty, I did that thing and I felt a whole lot better over time. Right. Like there's a lot of benefit that can come from exactly what you're saying.
Awesome. Okay. You ready for the next case?
Let's do number 2.
Okay, let's do it. Okay. So let's say we have a man in his late 40s. Let's say he has a major history of childhood trauma. So this one, the one we talked about previously, had a really normal childhood, nothing of note. But this gentleman has childhood trauma, long time anxiety as a result. Symptoms started with a panic attack. We don't really know why they started, but panic attacks have persisted. He's got dizziness 24/7 also. Has a whole bunch of different diagnoses. He's had to take time off work as a result. And he's just overwhelmed by the anxiety, the what ifs, and the doubts. And he's just in close to panicking all the time. So I would love to hear your take on, first of all, how you help him start to self-regulate, especially considering his background. Mm-hmm. And this may be even the same answer, but also how you start to help him work with those doubts and what ifs and the crippling worries that are just plaguing him.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think one thing that happens to a lot of people when they come to this work, and say someone's coming like this person with quite a bit of childhood trauma, right? Or adult trauma for some people. And a lot of people, after reading some books, they understand, okay, like trauma, symptoms, like these are like best friends. This is like, and we know this in research. There's not a therapist, researcher, doctor out there that's going to deny that connection, because they're just
Correct.
one thing that'll happen to people. And I don't know if this would happen to this individual, is they almost want to dive into that work like a little too fast, because like they understand there's a connection. But I like what you said, like there needs to be a starting place of regulation, because like if there's not 1 foot at least or half a foot in safety connection, then it's going to be really hard to move into things that are incredibly distressing. I know every person has a different take on it. Some people are, and you have to find a coach, therapist, doctor out there that matches, because some people are able to dive in right away. But in my experience, if we go too far, like it's almost too cathartic. Like they can't tolerate that. So there needs to be a starting with regulation. One thing that I talk about with people when I explain regulation is one thing I talk about, and I've heard you talk about this before too, actually, of what we mean by safety, because this is a really essential
Thank you.
thing. I actually just did a video on this recently. I'm sure you've done video at some point in the past as well. Safety is not just calmness here. It's not. Like, I think it can be. Don't get me wrong. We love feeling calm. Most of us feel safe when we feel calm. We can't always feel calm. And yes, I want to give people more access to that. I want people to have an ability to get there. That's really essential. But when we talk about regulation, it's not just calmness. When I talk about safety with people, I often say it's the second word that I say. We're talking about connection. Because when we're having a panic attack, or we're having high anxiety, or we're having high emotional distress, people become disconnected really quick. And what I mean by that is they're not present. They're not present in their body. They're not present externally. Like they just like click off, and they're just like waiting the storm. Now, sometimes like it's a human coping mechanism. Like we're going to do that, but safety needs to have some connection with it. It's possible to feel safe, for example, with anxiety. That is a possible thing that people can learn to do. And you're not going to be maybe fully calm. You might be 5% calm, but you're connected. You're able to be with it. You're able to tolerate sitting with it. You're able to have a gentleness with yourself, a compassion, a lightness as you attend to something that's distressing. So that's the first thing I explain to people when I'm talking about self-regulation. Now, when I talk about self-regulation in my approach, I'm often talking about like safety signals. We could talk about safety signals for 2 hours. So I'll like define this really quick for people. Safety signals are anything that helps you feel connected with yourself. It helps you feel a compassion, a lightness, an ease, even though there is dysregulation taking place. And so a presence, right? Like a very much connected in the moment. And when we talk about with that, I have people explore safety signals. So that's what I would probably do with this individual. I would have them explore safety signals in session. I usually even do a whole session on safety signals where all we're doing is we're exploring. So I'll have people practice some present moment sensing. So for example, this is like if you look around your space, like if people look around their space, and don't look where you cognitively want to look, but find a place in your room or your space that looks just right to look at and explore. And you're not just doing that, but you're noticing like what clicks, what changes in my body.
That's right.
Right. So you're noticing like the nervous system response as you present moment sense. If you're someone like myself, I hate sight. I find sight quite overwhelming. And I learned that early on. But something like soothing touch, rubbing my arms, or sounds work really well for me. It helps me feel very connected to the present with enough ease that I can still tolerate the unpleasantness. So present moment sensing is an example of a safety signal. They use this a lot in like somatic experiencing. They often start sessions like this where they have people connect to their environment because they understand that safety is connection. The other thing is like you can play around with breath work. Different types of breathing patterns will sometimes work for people. I do a lot of like somatic movement. A lot of it's taken from more qigong practices where it's just slow breathing and movement that works really well for some people. So that's another safety signal that you could try out, right? So there's a lot of them that you could play around with, like even just noticing like pleasant sensations. Because even if like you're very anxious, there's probably a part of your body that feels neutral, that feels pleasant, even if it's like just your toe or like the tip of your nose or whatever it might be. But these are things, and I would map this with someone pretty early on that's coming like this individual, because I want them to know before we ever move into trauma work or even like processing anxiety or doing any of that, of like, what's your safe zone? Like, what's our best bet that's going to create some regulation? And I would have people practice that in between sessions to really get used to doing that. Yeah, even on my channel, like if people ever want, like I have a whole safety like meditation where I exactly do this. I just play around with different ones so people can like track this for themselves, like if they're doing it kind of on their own without a
Yeah.
therapist or coach. But that's how I would usually start with someone, like if we're just starting to work towards regulation.
And I hear you saying, and I want to point out to people, finding these safety signals and applying them, it's not a one-way process. So it's not, I have a tool that I then apply to myself and it does something. It's a conversation. It's a two-way conversation. So you're using a safety message and then you're seeing how that safety message is being received. You're looking for feedback from yourself to see what's actually useful for you in various circumstances. That's why I, in particular, have a bit of a bias against affirmations. That's just my thing.
Yeah.
People can use affirmations by all means, and I love when people use their own affirmations. But that's why I've been so resistant to putting out an affirmations track, because I worry I don't, if you're just passively listening to me give you affirmations, you're not necessarily monitoring how those things are having an effect on you.
Yeah. I'm smiling right now because like 7 months ago, I put out like a safety
Oh,
message, like meditation. And some people, and the unfortunate part is it became like one of my bigger videos. And I was like,
oh, see, I've been missing out then,
I
Tanner.
know, but no, no, no. There's truth to what you're saying, because like some people like commented like, I didn't feel safe at all. And I even said at the beginning, like, you're gonna have to play
Yes,
around with this. Like,
yes, yes, yes.
so I had
Yes.
some creator regret around that one. But,
But
but you're
check it
right.
out because it does work for some people. I've
Yeah.
heard people say that about some of my videos that weren't
Yeah.
intended to be affirmation tracks. Oh my gosh, just turning on this track just makes me feel 1,000% better and my symptoms go down.
I know. And
And
that's the
that's
thing that
fine.
yeah, but that's I like what you said there. It's two-way communication. Like you're doing the practice, but don't just do the practice expecting, messages of safety or affirmations work for other people, so they're gonna work for me. Like this is not a one size. So like there needs to be an exploration of like playing around. Like that's what you do with like a therapist, a coach, a physician. Like you're playing around with these ideas to see what the effect is internally, like to see if you have that felt sense of safety. And the only way you discover that is you just try a bunch of them out to figure out like what's going to actually create enough regulation and make the rest of the work possible for me.
That's right. Very
Yeah.
good. Okay, so tie these in then to how this person might be able to start working on the what ifs and the doubts and the worries, because I can only imagine, I mean, especially if this person has a long history of trauma, that may take some time to untangle, but in the meantime, the greatest source of distress and threat is just his own mind, all these what ifs and the doubts and the worries and the constant rumination about symptoms. So how would he work with that?
Yeah, so there's kind of two ways that I play around with this with people. Well, there's probably many more than two ways, but two ways I'm thinking of right now. You could essentially use the safety signals for exactly that. So similarly, like if you start having doubts, if you start having worries, like if you're getting lost in that narrative in your mind, like could you shift to a safety signal to kind of like regulate a bit? Like it is a practice that, again, like we said in the last case, is going to take a lot of consistent effort to get there. that can work some of the time. One of the problems that I find with people where they have high anxiety is that they have high self-doubt, they have, high negative thinking that's taking place, and they have a real low tolerance for dealing with uncertainty. And the thing is that while healing, like we need a tolerance for dealing with uncertainty. For some people, it just clicks and they're like, I knew I would heal no matter what. But for a lot of us, that doesn't take place. I didn't, like most people don't know they were going to heal. Like most of the clients I worked with that healed, they weren't convinced they were going to heal at first. And they had to build a hopeful but uncertain kind of attitude around this, where you can be hopeful around this stuff and know that, like, hey, this could be effective. I think hope's a big part of these approaches at first when people are getting into the mind-body education. But there needs to be like a tolerance for sitting with uncertainty instead of like having that tape rolling of doubts that are taking place. You're seeing in as we go through these cases that I definitely have like a component of like somatic and very entrenched in my approach. But like
That's why I want to talk to you about
yeah,
this. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to hear this.
yeah, but I think that's like the safety signals would only be half or less than half of this battle. Like there needs to be over time a tolerance of sitting with uncertainty, or when symptoms get high, dealing with uncertainty or when they're going to go down. Because if we can have people focus on the sensation of uncertainty naturally and process that and over time create safety and connection with that, the doubts become less, not necessarily go away, but they become less like effective in their strategy of like making you more and more anxious, because you just understand that like, oh, like I'm just feeling uncertain and I can sit with this and I can work with this, instead of just rolling this tape through over and over again.
I noticed you said, and I want to point out to people, over time we build connection and safety with that uncertainty, with that doubt, with that what if. Notice, guys, that Tanner is not saying over time you suddenly just feel really connected and safe overall and you just don't have doubts anymore and the what ifs go away magically. That's not what we're saying at all. It's it's being able to tolerate having them and being there with them. Just I love how you defined safety. That was just a
Yeah,
revelation.
I think it's so important because, I always share with my clients, I know I have higher anxiety than a lot of people in the world.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
I have learned over time to sit with that, and it doesn't really negatively affect me most of the time. Like I can sit with it, and I actually feel quite safe with it. I feel quite connected with it. Now, over time, as a result, it's reduced. But there's people walking around the world. There are people like this. I share a story of what people think is going to happen, and I want to be clear: this isn't. I had a supervisor at a therapy clinic years back. Great therapist, great lady, probably the happiest person I will ever meet in my entire life. And I knew her quite well. And she was an outlier. Like, I don't think most people in their daily life are as happy as that lady. And I remember I asked her once, I was like, how many times, like, have you really been like anxious, like moderately level anxious? She could count on less than one hand. That's wild to me. And I like truly, like, I got to know her and I think that that was the case. Like, she really just had this ability, and that's what people think the goal is. But I think that like physiologically, that's not the reality for most people. And I'm not trying to make it sound hopeless, but like that uncertainty, that anxiety, we can learn to have quite a safety and connection and compassion with ourselves when it's there. And yes, that will reduce it over time, but still outcome independence here. That will reduce it over time, but that's not the main goal at first. Like we're just trying to get people to approach that sensation more.
That's right. Yes. Very good points. Okay. Before we move on to the last one, which relates to what you were saying earlier about hope, by the way, because this third client is dealing with a lot of hopelessness. Can you just give me just a quick rundown of how this might look in practice for this gentleman we were just discussing? So with all the what ifs and with the doubts, with childhood trauma, he's learned some of his safety messages. Can you give me an example? Like he's having a lot of what ifs and doubts and some really unpleasant sensations one afternoon. How does he put this into practice?
So the goal, I think, it would look at to varying degrees. I think to some degree, first off, it'd be kind of like with the first client where we talked about like checking for the scanner. It's almost like having that awareness of like the doubts. So like how quick can you catch that you're going down this doubt spiral? Because the quicker you catch it, the better typically. If you're 3 hours in, it's going to be harder to kind of pull that plane back up. But like the quicker people can catch it, the better. So like again, experiment with it. Like how quick can I catch this when it's starting to move down that road? And then the next step is like I would tell people, now you're going to play around with the two things I've talked about with you. Practicing the safety signal, whatever it might be, right? Could I shift from that to being present in my life, to exploring like the nature around me, to exploring the sounds around me? Could I shift to doing some breathing? Could I shift to doing some type of somatic movement, whatever it might be, right? Could I shift to using these safety signals to some degree to be more present and get out of the doubt spiral? And maybe they do that and it just goes horribly wrong. It's just like not working at all. And that's okay. Like they're playing around with it. Then I would shift to like, okay, if that's not working, like, could you somatically approach what's underneath the doubt, like the uncertainty, the anxiety? And you could shift back and forth. Like I always tell people, you're not just focusing on the unpleasant thing and diving in there and focusing on that for half an hour. Like, sure, if you can get there eventually, that's probably going to be beneficial. But at first, it's just a somatic skill that Peter Levine from somatic experiencing calls pendulating. I often just call it shifting. There's a shifting back and forth. Like, could you shift back and forth between focusing on the uncertainty for a while, exploring that, diving into that, and then shifting to a safety signal, right? Maybe shifting to the sounds around you. Feel a little bit more regulated, get back to the present moment, shift back to the uncertainty. So like I teach people, it's a simple skill, but it's a really useful skill for people to practice doing. Because eventually your nervous system, it'll almost start to automatically do that. But at first we need to almost like intentionally teach it. Like we don't just need to focus on the unpleasant, or we don't just need to like focus on like creating as much calmness as possible. Like we can practice shifting back and forth. So I think these would be the things that I would have them practice, either just using the safety signals something about, or some type of somatic work of like going back and forth between the two, and just shifting out of those doubts as much as they can as they do that.
And I noticed none of the things you said involve trying to rationalize with yourself and convince yourself that everything's okay. So
Yeah.
just take note, everyone, of that.
Yeah. It's an important one. The odd time that'll work, it's great. But I think when someone has that much anxiety and that many doubts, like we said, it's just going to be followed by 50 more doubts.
Right.
So like, yeah, it's just being cautious with some of that.
Okay. Thank you. Wonderful. Moving on, our final sample client for the day.
Oh, yeah.
So this person, again, the example I'm giving, I'm sure everyone's going to have components they relate to, even if they're not in this position. But woman in her 60s, had a stroke and a fall, diagnosed with post-concussion syndrome, totally debilitated, often stuck in bed, having trouble figuring out how to even get started, just because she's so super sensitized. She really just can't tolerate a lot of things. She has days where she can't get out of bed. She can't tolerate any kind of lights or screens or movement or even sounds sometimes.
Yep.
And she's been trying to do things like somatic tracking, but she just finds the fear and sensation so overwhelming. At somatic tracking, she can't do it with a light touch, shall we say.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, how would you start to approach the severe sensitization in terms of helping this person get moving again and starting to tolerate exposure activities? And also how you might modify a tool like somatic tracking for someone who's unable to do it with a light touch.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think they kind of go hand in hand. There's a tie-in. One thing I always tell people, like if you're struggling, I'll talk about the somatic tracking one first, if that's okay.
Sure.
Because this is common. People are like trying to do it, but they're like so intense, like they get so locked on, they're so sensitized that it just escalates things like really quick. And it doesn't work for some people. Like I have lots of somatic tracking recordings and things, but after 5 minutes, it might be way too much for someone, or after 2 minutes, it might be way too much for someone. So I think with somatic tracking or with the graded exposure to like increasing like their ability to live life and move and do these things, I'm just like I tell people, you just have to be honest about where your starting point is. Don't compare it, because that's where people get into trouble is like, oh, I can only do somatic tracking for a minute. Like, what's the point? Or I can only like slowly move my arm for like 30 seconds. Like, what's the point? Well, there's the point. Like, I think you just have to find where your starting place is and be really honest about that and not trying to push yourself, because this is where people have this cycle of high flares take place is they try to do it, they try to do Alan Gordon's somatic tracking on Curable, which is great somatic tracking, but they try to do that for 7 to 10 minutes and it's just like way too much. And it's just like we have to be realistic about it. The second thing, that if someone's this sensitized and struggling this much with somatic tracking, I always explain regulation first, then brain retraining. That's the key. For some people, they can dive into somatic tracking, they can dive into those sensations of dizziness or fatigue or whatever and do it. For other people, like they need that foot in safety again, in regulation, bringing some of that connection and maybe calmness and ease if they're lucky into their system, and then do the brain retraining. I think it's a really useful thing that sometimes people don't think about, that can be helpful here. I've worked with people where they have to do 10 minutes of breath work. They really enjoy it. They get into it, and then they can go do an exposure exercise, right? Of starting to lock or starting to get some exposure to lights or to sounds. Because, yeah, for someone that's that sensitized, they probably are going to need a lot of that regulation online first before they kind of move to the brain retraining elements. So, if people are struggling with just the brain retraining, like that's where all those safety signals and regulation skills can be really helpful at first, because you can start there and then do that. So that would be.
I have this question that's coming up as you're saying this, because I think this is just such an important distinction, because so many of the people I work with have so much anxiety going on. They'll say, yeah, I've been working on that with a therapist for 3 years and I still just don't feel regulated and safe. So I can't do it. So does being able to, again, I think you've already answered this, but my understanding and the way I think about it is, you may not feel calm. It's just as you said, you may not feel safe when you're doing these things. It may not feel pleasant. It's not about trying to feel good.
Yeah.
Giving yourself a safety signal and being able to tolerate doing it, and then coming back and giving yourself a safety signal and being able to tolerate doing it, may not be a pleasant thing. It may not feel good or comfortable.
Yeah. And this is the reason I always tell people, because it's fair. Like I hear people say that of, I'm always anxious. Like I've been anxious for 5 years. And I'm sure there's some moments where they feel a little bit more safe and connected that maybe they miss out on, because that happens to all of us when we're that dysregulated. But that's the thing. It's like every time I do the exposure, I'm anxious. And here's the thing is, like, no matter what you do, the exposure is going to be hard. That's why it's called exposure. And I don't say that to invalidate people. I really don't mean that in an invalidating way, but this is why it's exposure. This is why it's difficult. It's like you're getting exposure to something you fear, whether it's the sensations, whether it's like the activity or the movements. It's never going to feel really good as you start to do that. So we can't just go off of like, I need to feel good while I do this. Eventually, sure, I want someone to get there. But like when you're starting new things, it's never going to feel really good. It's going to feel fearful. And we're going to like slow. And that's why you're doing this in this slow, graded way. And you have to be honest with your starting place. But it's just knowing that it's, and every time you bump it up again to do a little bit more, all of a sudden it's not going to feel good again. And then over time, as you repetitively do it, it might start to feel a little bit better. You get a little more used to it. The fear goes down. That's the goal of exposure. And then you bump it up again.
Right.
So I think, yeah, it's just people being really honest with their starting place. Same with somatic tracking. If your starting place is you can do it for 30 seconds, that's your starting place. That's okay. And it's probably not going to feel that good because you're attending to something that's unpleasant inside. Eventually, we want to try to rewire the brain and create a bit more safety, or, I know it's going to be far off for people, but even like a pleasantness involved as well. But at first, it's just not going to feel that great as you start to work away at this.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts then on a structured behavioral approach for someone like this? So in other words, I mean, I, again, kind of like you, I'm very into working with people on a deeper level than just the cognitive, but I wonder if you've found with people like this who are in just such a sensitized place, they're just dealing with so much, and their lives are so limited, that having like a schedule or a list of things or tasks, or not really pacing, but great, like a more structured approach to graded exposure. Have you found that helpful?
For some, yes. Like I think to some degree, when people are so sensitized and everything, like the world's so small, like it needs to be a little bit more like scheduled out. I'm cautious because I know, you have someone that's more obsessive compulsive personality type, like I talked about last time. We want to be cautious there because I think I've seen that happen where they're rigidly doing it 5 times a day for a minute. So we'll just assume this person's not like that for the sake,
Right.
but like that would be something different. I would be cautious with the rigidity. But generally, when someone's that much, like I am doing a lot of support of like figuring out, okay, first off, like what are the things you want to get to? That's how I start this conversation. Because most people, if they can't walk, it's not like they love walking. They might miss walking because what walking brings them and what the activities they could do. So I really outline first off, like far off, like what is the goal? Like what do you want to get to?
And
Because
why?
yeah,
Yeah.
why? Like what's that going to bring you? Like let's say this person wants to be in a bowling league. This is like I don't know
Perfect.
why I give that example, but
Perfect.
that's the goal.
Perfect.
Bowling's great. I'm a terrible bowler, but I think it's quite fun. But that's their goal. Like I want to go back to being in a bowling league and doing this twice a week. That's going to be a lot of fun. Like I like connecting with my friends as we do that. Great. I want to define that because I want to then winnow this down of like, okay, what are the very small things we need to do to get you there first? Like, what are the first steps? Okay, the first step is me being able to get out of bed and stand for 30 seconds. Great. The first step is for me being able to have the blinds open with the sun coming into the room for, 20 seconds. Great. Like I start really small so that like it's realistic. And usually, if it doesn't work, just winnow down more is the secret. And whatever it is, no matter how small it is, that's your starting place. And then you work your way up. So I am doing a bit more of that, to be honest, when someone's so sensitized and their world is kind of so small. Such as when you see with like concussions and stuff, with a lot of these symptoms coming up. Like I'm probably doing a lot more of that work to get them started. Eventually, the exposure can become a bit more spontaneous. But when it's those really small, basic function things, like you almost have to be a little bit more structured,
Yeah.
depending on the case.
I agree with you. Again, as you said, there's always the danger of feeding anxiety and rigidity, but I think just like you said, working backwards from something that you actually care about is exactly the way to do it. It's just like you said, the problem people run into is they go too big, like they're being too like non-specific, or they're just kind of trying to follow what other people are doing. Oh, okay, I'm supposed to somatic track and go for walks or whatever. But when you have that much sensitization and you're that fearful, you really, you need to find what's going to give you courage, or whatever other quality is
Yeah.
going to help you be persistent and actually do the things.
And I think this is going to help with that hopeless feeling, because I hear this so many times. Like, I've tried this pacing and graded exposure so many times. And the thing is it was just too big. It was too idealistic of like, this is what I should be starting with.
Yes.
I need to be here. And then they feel hopeless. You see this a lot with, perfect example of this is like depression. There's lots of ways to work with depression. One of the greatest things about depression that need to happen is people need to increase behaviors as well. It's the same idea. Like, people need to do a little bit more, get a little bit more active, do these things. What will happen to people is they make their goal way too big. So it's like, I'm going to go for like a 5-kilometer run today, and they haven't exercised in 2 years. Then they don't do it. Then they feel like they failed, and then they sink more and feel more hopeless.
That's right.
So like,
They need
that's
to be
why,
achievable.
yeah, like you need to give yourself a win here. As small as it might be, like, you need to give yourself a little bit of win, because, it's not like that's going to breed motivation, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like, that's going to breed this sense of motivation and hopefulness that's going to help push it along. So you're actually
Exactly.
way better to start small than start with too big of a lofty goal.
Exactly. Exactly. And by the way, you can work backwards behaviorally, which most people find easiest because it's so concrete. Like, I want to be in a bowling league. What are the things I have to be able to do that? But you can also work backwards based on state. We talked about state a little bit earlier, like on a feeling. So
Yeah.
if my goal is to be in a bowling league, why? What feeling would I get from that? Well, I'd feel like a sense of fun. I'd feel a sense of connection or purpose.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd feel a little bit more like myself. And you could dig into that a little bit more. And then you could break it down, break it down, break it down, and say, if you did have a sense of purpose and fun right now, what is the very first thing that you would do? Like, in right now in this conversation with me. And people might say, well, I'd probably crack a joke or something. It might be something
Yeah.
super small.
Yeah.
Well, those types of things can also, we can create some of these states, these more constructive states of feeling or being, by finding the states that we want to have and implementing small things that can bring us those states now. With the giant caveat, and I'm sure, Tanner, you have something to say about this. We're not just saying, oh, just be positive all the time. Oh, just practice feeling what you want to feel. That's not what we're saying. But when you're in a state of hopelessness like this, having glimmers, I think Deb Dana calls them,
Yeah. Yeah.
having glimmers where you do feel present and connected and like yourself, that's going to be enormously motivating to you.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's it. Like, you're not, like, it's a line of like, for example, like, there's studies to show that people that walk more are less likely to be depressed. This isn't probably shocking to most people. It's just the reality. Like,
Yeah.
and we're trying to facilitate almost a similar thing of like, you can start to behave in these ways to work towards that feeling you want to feel when you're in the bowling league. And yeah, you're not going to force it, but you can put the actions in, and sometimes that feeling kind of follows. So like, I think both can be true. Like, I don't want people like forcing a certain feeling. That's not going to be helpful. But can you have these like behaviors externally that you're doing to try to create that feeling over time? I think that is a potential that could happen for people. Yeah.
Exactly. All right. Well, I think we did some great work today. I think of the 6 little problems or troubleshooting problems we talked about today, I'm sure people listening to this are going to relate to at least one or more of those. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective on them. I learned from you some new ideas that I can use with my clients. And of course, as always, you and I are also so aligned in how we think about this. So it was also refreshing and affirming to hear you say the things that you said. Yeah. So Tanner, thank you so much for being here. And I would love to do this again sometime. So for those of you
Yeah.
listening, if you have specific questions about your recovery or specific troubleshooting questions, I invite you to leave those as comments here on the YouTube channel. If you're here on YouTube, if you're listening to this as a podcast, you can head over to YouTube to leave a comment. I will see them and maybe Tanner and I can meet again to talk about this another time. And as always, if you could like, share the video or the podcast, subscribe to my channel if you're on YouTube, or give the podcast a follow. These things help me reach more people. And of course, most importantly, Tanner, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I have my YouTube channel, Tanner Murtagh, MSW, that people can check out. I'll send you the link after.
Yep,
And
it'll be in the video and podcast description too.
Yeah, I do have a therapy agency with multiple therapists, but I do state to people, just because of regulations, we're only able to work with clients located in certain provinces in Canada. So people are welcome to check that out. And then I also have our digital course through our other agency, and I'll send you the link for that people can look into that as well. But I wanted to say this was a great episode. I really like this idea. We almost need to be going back and forth. Like we each come up with like these cases from questions. And
I know.
It's a really interesting idea that you came up with.
Yeah. Yeah. So, hey guys, if you like that idea, you should definitely let us know in the comment section. Because again, we will see that feedback and we'll say, okay, people are interested in that. Maybe we should put something like that together.
Yeah.
Again, I'd love to hear from you listening, those of you listening. And Tanner, I agree. This was so much fun. And I feel like we could have spent the entire episode on just the first one. Honestly, there are just so many things we could have talked about, but I think you still gave such great ideas that are immediately actionable for people. So thank you so much for being here.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
All right. Well, take care, Tanner. And thank you again. And thank you to all of you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.